They didn't want to help. I mean, the senior people in charge of me, once they'd had what they wanted, which was me as a witness, they sort of dropped me a bit. I was never really pleased about that. I felt very put upon.
Few, if any, of the 40 or so people who sign up on the witness protection programs in the United Kingdom each year have any idea of just what they are letting themselves in for. Although it inevitably involves a major, often traumatic change in their circumstances, the decisions almost always have to be taken in a matter of minutes, overnight at most. Although they are generally lumped together, there are in fact two distinct categories of protected witness. The first is the innocent bystander, for example the housewife who sees a gangland execution from her living room window. Should such a witness agree to give evidence, they would first be moved into a hotel, all expenses paid, and have statements taken. There would be assigned one or sometimes two police handlers, whose job is to ensure their comfort and safety at all times. In the run-up to the trial, they will be asked to choose where they would like to live. If they are a homeowner, the police will arrange the purchase of a new property and the sale of the old. If they rent from a council, the police will arrange for them to move into a new area with a minimum of fuss. Until they are settled into a new job, they will be paid a salary the same as what they were earning before, in addition to any reward. They will, of course, still be restricted from seeing their friends and families ever again, but because the crooks generally have little idea who they are or who they associate with, the danger to those around them is fairly minimal. Depending on the severity of the threat against them, such witnesses can even choose to relocate to a number of countries around the world. Witnesses are often awarded large sums from public funds, and in the case of those who inform on robbers or major thefts, they can receive tens of thousands of pounds from banks or insurance companies. When truck driver Chris Booker was asked to drive a shipment of heroin worth £2 million into the United Kingdom, he went straight to the police. His evidence saw the gang of three sent to prison, and Booker was given a new identity, and rewards and payments totalling more than £80,000. When it comes to testifying in court, any jury in the land would have little difficulty understanding what an enormous sacrifice the person has made, all in the interest of justice, and their evidence will be treated with the utmost respect. They have no criminal connections. They have no interior motive. Even the defence barristers will shy away from attacking such a witness too harshly for fear of turning the jury against their own clients. The second category of protected witness enjoys no such privileges. They are, like Nichols, professional criminals who turned grass because it is their only choice they have. Failure to cooperate with the police will either lead to a long prison sentence or, in the worst case scenario, certain death. The major difference between the first and second categories is that the police will never let the second, no matter how critical their evidence, no matter how key their role is in the forthcoming trial, forget that they are criminals. Rather than being kept in a hotel or safe house, they are more likely to spend their first 3 months being moved from special prison units to police stations as they make their statements. Even a glimpse of someone they think they recognise means that they will be instantly be moved. Rather than being given some form of income the same as what they had before, they are reduced to living on benefits. The idea is that if you admit to having made some money from the crime in the past, all your past earnings are tainted with the same brush. Only by reducing your income to virtually nothing, and the police hope to counter any accusations of bribery or favouritism. Furthermore, in order to ensure that the subject comes across as a witness with nothing to hide, they must first confess to every single crime they have ever committed, even the crimes they were never caught for. Not only must they confess, but they must agree to plead guilty to the crimes in court, and accept whatever sentence the judge wishes to hand out to them. Failure to do this can invalidate their place on the programme. The last thing the police want mid-trial is the defence to suddenly bring up the fact that their key witness was involved in organising an armed robbery with one of the defendants 5 years earlier. There are no guarantees, no promises. Protected witness status merely means that the police will inform the judge that you have been an assistance to them. It is up to the judge to gauge how valuable that assistance has been, and whether or not the subject deserves a reduction in their sentence. There are plenty of cases where witnesses have been given longer sentences than those that they are given evidence against, particularly in cases where the trial has collapsed or the accused have walked free. The phrase supergrass was first coined in 1973 when Derek Bertie Smalls, an active armed robber who had been involved in a £138,000 robbery in Wembley, was tracked to his Northampton hideout for his au pair girl. Caught banged to rights and facing a long sentence, Smalls offered to strike a deal if the Home Secretary gave him a written guarantee that he himself would be immune from prosecution for every crime he'd ever committed. Then he would happily give evidence against everyone he had ever worked with. Within a year, Smalls' evidence led to more than 150 arrests, and 21 of his former associates were jailed for a total of 308 years. Bertie Smalls never served a single day. Panic spread throughout the underworld like wildfire. Dozens of hardened villains, worried about what Smalls might be saying about them, began to give evidence themselves, and the spectacle of one member of a gang appearing as the star witness in a trial of the others became a regular one. The numbers increased further still after stories of the treatment provided to self-professed King Squealer Lawrence O'Mahony began to emerge. While being held at Chiswick Police Station, he would get his favourite paper every morning alongside with his tea and toast. When it came to meal times, food was brought in from local restaurants and served with linen napkins and silver-plated cutlery. To prevent him from going stir-crazy, he'd be taken from his cell every now and then for a boozing session or a slap-up meal or for a day at the races. It was even said that prostitutes were provided on a regular basis. Little wonder then that some of the most violent, vicious, vile men in criminal history suddenly came forward wanting to tell all, knowing that regardless of what they had done, they would not face prosecution themselves. A bad taste started to develop in the mouths of the public by the early 80s, when characters like John Charles, the head of Britain's only known Murder Incorporated style contract killing company, decided to implicate former colleagues in 6 murders rather than face the rap for a huge series of robberies. Charles was rewarded with a single life sentence and no recommended minimal term at a time when the memory of the Cray twins, who had each killed one person but received 30-year minimum sentences, was still fresh in many minds. Within a few years, after a number of trials started to collapse, the whole notion of the supergrass had completely fallen out of favour with both police and juries. Today, under the new name of protected witness, they are rarely if ever granted full immunity from prosecution, and the levels of comfort they are allowed to receive are strictly monitored. At first, Darren Nichols talked only about Jim, how he'd met him, how he'd led him to the drugs in the lake, how they'd fabricated a story about where the drugs had come from, and how they'd shared the reward. Then he moved on to talk about what he'd told Jim about Michael Steele, how he'd passed on details about all the importations he'd known about, and how Jim had failed to do anything about any of them. When the tape ran out, they started again, talking about how Steele had imported drugs since the beginning of the year, and how he'd given Jim his theory on the reasons behind the killings of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. When it came to Nichols' own involvement in smuggling and selling drugs, he'd only gone abroad once, and then his passport had run out. He never spoke to Dopey Harris, just sat in the bar drinking beers. He'd never made any money from selling drugs. He deliberately fudged the truth to make himself look good, to look like some concerned citizen who had just happened to be friendly with a couple of drug dealers and had decided to help bring them to justice. At the time it seemed like the best option. The only policeman he'd ever spoken to before that had betrayed him. He simply didn't know who to trust. Eventually, as the interviews moved on and focused more and more on the murder, so Nichols began to open up and be more honest. His full involvement in Steele's importations became clear, as did his role in distributing and selling drugs around Braintree and other Essex towns. But there was no going back over the first interviews, and his early reticence and lies would turn out to be a mistake that would come back to haunt him with a vengeance. Officially, the Protected Witness Unit does not exist. For many years it was based at H&P Woodhill in Bedfordshire, but recently it moved to another prison in the south of England, the location of which is a closely guarded secret. It used to house criminals who have agreed to provide valuable assistance to police and other law enforcement agencies. In other words, supergrasses. The Protected Witness Unit is intended to offer them absolute protection from other prisoners by ensuring that no one knows who they really are. The inmates are even told to keep their true identities secret from one another and from prison staff. Instead of their real names, Every one of the dozen inmates is referred to as Blogs, followed by a number. Darren Nichols was Blogs 19. Protected Witness Unit is a prison within a prison. The idea is not so much to prevent the inmates from escaping. The vast majority know only too well they are far safer inside than out, but to prevent anyone from breaking in. By February 1997, Darren Nichols had been in custody for the best part of a year, and had for the first time ever failed to spend Christmas with his wife and family. Sandra was by now firmly ensconced in the new safe house, but despite repeated requests, the police ruled that for his own protection, Nichols had to remain in custody until after the trial. After his initial arrest, when Nichols was being held in numerous police stations across Essex, Sandra saw him every couple of weeks, and the pair would tip the custody sergeant to turn a blind eye while they had frantic sex on his cell bed. But once Nichols moved to the Blogs unit, Sandra could no longer bring herself to go. By this time round, Sandra didn't have her friends and family around her to support her during the separation. In fact, she felt completely isolated and was terrified of saying anything that could accidentally put her life in jeopardy. As the gulf between him and his wife widened, Darren Nichols spent weeks arguing with the police and the courts that the only way to save his family was to allow him to live with them. After all, the family would be living in the same safe house once the trial had finished. How could it be unsafe one day, then magically be safe the next? At first the police were reluctant to give any ground, but Nichols started threatening to withdraw his statements, to refuse to take the stand. Eventually the police agreed to refer Sandra to an expert psychiatrist and placed the decision in his hands. The report by Dr. Albert Fox, published on February the 5th, 1997, was damning. Since Mrs. Nichols was taken with her children suddenly and without initial explanation in the middle of the night into police custody last May, she has had 3 destructive moves of home. She weeps quite often and has the wish to go to sleep until it is all over. These changes involve domicile, school and identities. I can't even tell the neighbours my real name. The whole thing's a farce. What hurts most is probably separation from her husband, from whom she has a good relationship. No contact for 4 months, except by daily 5-minute phone calls. Lonely is the only thing I feel. I can't make friends like other people have friends. Never could. Paula tells me to go and talk to other mothers at school, but I just can't. Paula's not sympathetic. She's got no understanding of what I'm going through. It's just a job to her. She doesn't get involved emotionally. Mrs. Nichols wept a good deal during the interview. How does she sleep? Under a rug on a sofa in front of the TV mostly. As soon as you get your head into bed, you're awake. You toss and turn and think about it all. She has also started drinking a bottle of wine a night for something to do, for oblivion. The report concluded the sooner the family can be reunited with their father, the better. On the 24th of February 1997, Darren Nichols was granted bail on condition that he reside at the safe house with his family and adhered to certain guidelines. There was to be a strict curfew, which meant he was only able to leave his home between 8 AM and 8 PM. He was never allowed to travel more than 25 miles from his front door, and he was not allowed to seek any form of employment. Any breach would mean an immediate return to prison. At first Sandra enjoyed having her husband back, but the dream quickly turned into a nightmare. The murder trial was set to begin at the Old Bailey on the 1st of September, and as the weeks went by, Sandra watched her husband become more and more frustrated, more and more stressed, and increasingly bitter and angry about his situation and what the future held for him. As the trial loomed even nearer, Darren Nichols became more and more nervous about what might happen. In particular, the prospect of Mick and Jack going free played on his mind. He found it impossible to talk about it with his wife, who was becoming increasingly bitter about the enforced separation from her family. His police handlers had no time for him unless he was making statements. Nichols decided to make a video diary of his thoughts and feelings. He began filming himself at home. Such was his relief at being able to offload his anxieties. He even smuggled the camera into his prison cell to help him cope with the stresses and strains in the final days before the trial.